I'm very, very grateful to speak to Blair Glencorse in Washington at this 8th Silk Road Cultural Belt Conference. Blair, you write in your mission statement of the Accountability Lab, following formulation: the Accountability Lab empowers and educates citizens to find their voices and works to make sure those voices are heard upon governments.
Mm.
You have done this successfully in more than 7 countries, in Liberia, in Nigeria, in Mali, South Africa, Mexico, and other parts of the world. And you personally, you have, from reading about your work, from what I understood, the question, what accountability itself and responsibility as a value, or an incorruptible behavior also as a value, but also as a position, an internal position, a moral, ethical position, means in the 21st century, has been part of your personal search for knowledge. So you, from what I understood. So my first question is, in the context of what we discussed before about the Responsible Listeners Award we are working on as a format, question: which role does listening play in this context?
I think that's a great question, and it's one of the reasons I was interested in the idea of responsible listening, because I think all of this has to begin with listening. Of course, if we're talking about citizens' voices and community voices being a key piece of accountability and of policy making, as I think they should be. This should be all about people, and it should be all about understanding how governments can serve those people. Then listening has to be the very first thing that happens, because unless those in power understand what it is that people need and want, it's very difficult for them to provide it, of course, and that begins with listening. But as you insinuated, it has to be responsible listening, and it has to be active listening, I think, which is very different to just hearing something. It really needs to be a process of understanding what it is that citizens need and want, and allowing them to have a voice, because that piece of things is often missing. Either people are excluded, their voices are excluded from policy making, or they are heard but they're not necessarily listened to. So it's actually a big piece of what needs to happen right at the beginning, and it needs to underpin, I would argue, pretty much everything when it comes to policy making and governance.
And I mean, you had the chance to observe in very different communities and in different social contexts how the idea of listening and the idea of responsibility was the focus of accountability is understood, and that when we are learning about the different traditions and the different perception of these ideas or values in the north and the south or east or west of the planet, how would you describe this difference of these different traditions of responsible listening or responsible listeners, or of responsibility and listening? Is there some common understanding, or where did you discover the biggest difference?
Good question. Obviously, it varies dramatically, I think, across contexts. Not just listening, but local conceptions and understandings of all sorts of related concepts like accountability and integrity, and also, of course, the historical pathways in terms of governance and decision making are all very, very different depending on the context, and that can make it more difficult or perhaps easier to find a path towards more effective and transparent governance. But I think there are some contexts where communities have often, because of very difficult challenges, managed to grow this idea of listening and engagement, collective engagement, sort of from the bottom up in ways that are really instructive. And it's, and this is not necessarily in the places that we think tend to be better governed, like Europe or North America. It's places like Nepal, where, because of the conflict, for example, there's a very strong tradition of community management of resources, forests, for example, or even public services like schools, because for a long time there wasn't really a state that could provide for its citizens. So communities did that on their own, and that meant they had to listen to each other, they had to coordinate and cooperate with each other, and created effective bottom-up systems for collective administration of resources. So I think what would be interesting from the Responsible Listeners Award would be to look at some of the places actually where we can learn some of these really interesting techniques, and where citizens have been engaged in creative listening processes all around the world, and see how they could be amplified and could be replicated perhaps in other ways, or at least codified and shared to inform others. So I think it varies dramatically, and every society has its own ways of doing these things, and I think that is certainly something that you could draw out through this process.
Yeah, I mean, from a musical and artistic point, it's or perspective, there is a huge tree in the musical, in the world of music, where if you just take classical music or the concept of classical music in an African context or European context, in an Asian context, and the idea of listening, the ideas, they are so the way how to listen, the way to translate the concept of responsibility in expression, there are very, very, very different traditions, and it's, for me, talking to you is it's a great privilege and a great honor, Blair, because you have practiced in so many ways the great potential our time actually shares, that we can try out new forms of learning and participation and bottom-up approaches to involve the community, in our case to involve an audience, to involve listeners in a co-creation process.
Mm-hmm.
When we translate this into a very concrete context and a very concrete idea, like, for example, the EU connectivity strategy, like the basic now key strategic vector of the European Union in their external relations, like this idea to really boil down and to concentrate and prioritize one term among many other terms, or one value among many other values, and they agreed on the term connectivity as a major trend, but also as a basic position to connect people, to connect the world. Question: how would you describe the relation between a value like connectivity and listening? And what role does accountability play?
Great question. I think they're very much connected, but I suppose it depends to some extent what's meant by connectivity. And I think there's a danger that we interpret it as sort of thin connectivity, perhaps, rather than thick connectivity. It's making sure everybody is online, for example, but it's not making sure that everyone is actually meaningfully understanding each other, and overcoming differences in a more conceptual and intellectual way. And that's where the listening comes in, of course. If we're going to actually really connect with people meaningfully, it's about hearing what they're saying and internalizing it and understanding it, so that we can better really truly connect with them. And that, as I pointed out, is a key piece of accountability. Unless we really understand each other, it's very difficult to know what our collective needs are, and how to create policies and processes, and engagement strategies to create the kind of society that we want to live in, individually and collectively. But that's where the EU, I think, is so interesting, and I think that, as a strategy, has real potential, because it is such an incredible example, despite all of the challenges, of truly overcoming differences and trying to create this common shared future and way of understanding each other despite many differences. So it's all, I think, very much connected, but of course the challenge is in the implementation, and moving beyond, unfortunately, what has become in our modern society often very thin connectivity, very loose, and not particularly meaningful connectivity, with really deep, much more inclusive listening and collective community building.
I mean, from your experience of building up the integrity idol and the work of the different teams in the various countries you're operating, I mean, this diversity of ideas, even if you take connectivity as a term or as an idea, or listening or responsibility, I mean, what I still observe is that sometimes the precondition for understanding each other is a common, of course, term, common ground, common understanding. And sometimes we just don't know that there is a completely different idea of integrity in a different part of the world or in another part of the world. Question: how did you overcome this, or how did you work with absence of understanding, like when you're dealing or were dealing with huge difference in understanding a specific term like accountability? How do you work with this abyss, or with this sometimes just absence of understanding?
I think a campaign like Integrity Icon, part of the goal is to create precisely this conversation, because there isn't always the same or a shared conception of what integrity is or what accountability is, certainly across countries, but even within countries and within communities. Everybody has their own idea about these things, and part of what the campaign tries to do is to create a conversation about that, not to try and create agreement, or in any way to impose an understanding of that term, but to allow people to think about it themselves, and reflect on it, and then hopefully for that to inform the way that they engage and that they understand their society and the kind of people that they, in this case, want in government. But absolutely, the terms can mean very different things, and I think we can sometimes get very caught up in the language, to the detriment, actually, of the actual process of listening and understanding. But I think music is a very interesting example, of course, of a common language. I can't think of a society that doesn't, of course, appreciate music in some form, and relate to it. And so we run other programs that use music because it's such a fantastic way to get people engaged and meet them, as we say, kind of where they are rather than where we want them to be.
Yeah.
And it has to be done authentically. The music, I think needs to be genuine and authentic. But if you can infuse that music with messages around social change and integrity and accountability, that is a fantastic way to get societies talking and listening and understanding different issues in a very different way. And for us in particular, with young people, I mean, we tend to, because that demographic is so important, use a lot of the kinds of music that young people are into to draw them into conversations and actions and behavior changes around these sorts of concepts like responsibility and integrity. And it works amazingly well for reasons that you very well understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the context of now developing a plan how to realize such an award. And it's, I mean, there's so internally at Callias Foundation and in the board of trustees and in our wider network or circle of supporters. It's a big. There are so many questions of when we look into a situation like the Polytechnical University in Hong Kong right now. I mean, demonstrations in Bolivia, in Lebanon, in Algeria. There are hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating and like calling to be listened. And I mean, it's so many people where I'm asking myself, is this an expression of the feeling that nobody listens to them? Or is this, what is missing? I mean, this question of responsible listeners can be also understood in a very wrong way, like that you impose a certain understanding on a group of people, and if they don't follow, then they are not responsible, like this kind of thing. So what is your experience working with this enormous diversity of needs in a community and the need to have an integral government or an integral responsible leader with a with this, why the idea of responsible listeners could help in this situation, in your perception?
I completely agree. First of all, that many of these protests are driven by an inability of people in power to listen to citizens at lots of different levels and in lots of different ways. But that's really at the core of it, because again, it's at the core of accountability. Unless those people making decisions are listening and then responding to citizens, then they are not being accountable. And it manifests itself in different ways. A lot of, I think, the current protests are driven kind of primarily by income inequality. But if you scratch the surface, actually, it's all about corruption and a lack of accountability, because that is at the core of it. And it's frustration that has built up over many years in most cases, and then it becomes too much and explodes in the ways that we're seeing in Bolivia or Lebanon, etc. And you're right. I think that some of these power holders can manipulate the concept of accountability and responsible listening and suggest that these people who are pushing back against them are illegitimate or don't have the right to do so. And I think there's an argument to be made that this process should happen within systems, not outside them. But the thing is, in these societies, of course, the systems simply haven't listened, haven't been reactive to some of these voices, and therefore the only option left to many citizens, they feel, is to work around the systems and to find their voices in other ways. So instead of peaceful protests, it begins to erupt into violence, for example. So I think responsible listening has to be at the core of all of this, and I think there's some really interesting work to be done to bridge divides. Not just in those sorts of places where there are big people's movements happening, but in the UK and the US and other places now around Europe where there's massive divisions politically, and people have to be brought together and to listen to each other in ways that can build a shared understanding to move forward. Because in many cases, I think actually the differences aren't that big. It's just that they have been amplified by lots of factors. And I think if we can get back actually to having structured conversations and listening to each other, we might realize that we have more in common and less differences between us than we think. Yeah. And I think the idea of responsible listening is really interesting because it even in the term itself makes people think about how they are truly interacting with others and listening to them. So much of what counts these days is having a voice and making your point of view heard, which is important potentially, but it immediately makes you think about how you are understanding what other people are saying. And I think when many of us think a bit harder about that, we realize that we're often not really listening responsibly. We are hearing and we are dismissing and we are fitting what other people are saying into certain prescribed boxes or ways of understanding the world that we have already created for ourselves. And so it allows us perhaps to step away from that mindset and actually meaningfully engage a bit differently, which I think is a big part of what needs to happen. The question, I suppose, for you around how you judge the award is that responsible listening could take very many different forms. So how do you compare the people that you might be considering or the organizations that you might be considering for this award, and how do you judge them and quantify this, which it's difficult, and it's part of what we've struggled with Integrity Icon as well. So I think there's work to be done, but I think it's a really, really interesting concept.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned before that it's very key to define very clear criteria. I mean, I'm still in the search actually of what makes more sense, to develop an award or to translate this idea into a context like the European Silk Road as an idea. This plan of a European Silk Road will be presented in Brussels on the coming Thursday. It will be discussed in another also meeting in Emshausen in February. So there is really a very concrete option and a very concrete possibility to make a difference in developing a European Silk Road. And question, how would you use an idea like responsible listeners in the context of a European Silk Road plan?
Good question. I don't know enough about the European Silk Road yet, to be honest. So please do send over more information and I can have a think about it. But I would think carefully about who sort of would own this process of responsible listening. I think the challenge is if it becomes too much if it is seen to be too much of an EU initiative, it might not be as legitimate as it could be, or might be seen to be a bit too technocratic, or not quite resonate with people in the way you might want it to. So it's not to say that the EU shouldn't be involved, or that it shouldn't be kind of coordinated with larger supranational efforts that the EU might be making. But but I think it should be perhaps owned at a more kind of community level, and through a coalition of great organizations that bring different things to the process and different conceptions of what responsible listening is. So yourselves, maybe some really interesting youth groups, for example, a creative media organization that really understands what you're doing, those kind of coalitions, which are the sort of kind of coalitions that we build for Integrity Icon in the different countries as well. So that it's not just seen as our own initiative, it's actually led and owned by a local coalition in each place that has credibility and has the networks and could reach people in the right sorts of ways and listens responsibly, because then they are the ones that get what needs to happen and can fill the process with creativity and credibility, which the EU, does many good things, but it isn't necessarily flexible and adaptive and creative at the local level in the way maybe that you want this to be.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is to translate it really in on a local level. For example, if we just take the route of the European Silk Road, there is a northern route and there is a southern route, and to involve communities, villages, cities along this European Silk Road in the process of creating, for example, an EU citizen dialogue. I mean, I try to understand and to define very clearly how this new technical solutions, like, for example, Emmanuel Macron did this in France, this large citizen dialogue among French citizens. The European Commission or the European Union did a lot of, or does a lot of citizen surveys, like this kind of dialogue. And I mean, I totally agree. The question is how to find the right partners and how to bring the experience, for example, of an accountability lab, for example, how to translate it, or how to join forces and to develop such an idea together. One other question, and a bit different context. Our experience so far with the so-called wiiw Hub, we call this social wall for classical music. We have this in our foyer before, at the Berliner Dialogkonzerte we have there's the Parochialkirche, there is a very small foyer, we call this the sauna, it's like audience listeners are arriving and they are still with their, with their mobile phones and still with 1,000 thoughts. And we have this social wall where you can where all the listeners can share a thought about Haydn or about the music, about the hall, about the orchestra, about the idea, through the hashtag responsible listeners. So the idea there is to create a space where where listeners of the Berliner Dialogkonzerte, or maybe later of the European Dialogkonzerte, can get more close to each other, share a thought, to activate a dialogue. What we observe so far is that this, and it's actually the same with the Silk Road Cultural Belt as a narrative, with the confirming questions we introduced there, like how would you compose a Silk Road, or what is your idea of quality, for example. So what we observe is that the trust in these digital media and these digital tools is still, when we use it in the way we are using it, quite low. I mean, it's maybe due to the fact that we are in a German-speaking environment, so we are using an English hashtag because we are approached both local and globally different audiences. And the question is, how would you approach audiences or listeners, like EU citizens, for example, communities, when we take the European Silk Road or the Y-Silk Hub as an element of this dialogue, to make such a project from Europeans for Europeans and beyond?
Yeah, good question. We work in contexts, of course, that are often a bit lower tech than Europe generally, and so we use a lot more low tech tools. So that's one piece of it is, as you pointed out, what kind of tools do people trust, and do they feel comfortable engaging with? So we actually do something similar in Liberia, where we have artists that paint interactive murals on walls in busy communities around, for example, budget issues. So the average citizen does not understand necessarily the Liberian budget. They're not always able to read. They're not going to download the document and look at what is being spent on different things. But if an artist draws that on a wall and says, imagine we had 10 bags of rice, and 2 of those bags of rice are being spent on education and 3 are being spent on healthcare.
Great.
What does that mean to you? And he creates a conversation, and then there's like a chalk wall where people can write something or draw a diagram, or and so it's it's a similar concept. It's just the low tech version in some ways. That obviously resonates locally because it adapts to the context. But your point about language, I think, is a good one. It's in some ways a pity that English has become such a universal language, because I do think many people, of course, are much more comfortable engaging with each other in their own language, and it's important that they do so, because there are many concepts and ideas that are only really authentic in a local language. So to the extent that this can be localized in that way, both in terms of the tools and approaches, and also the language in the different places that you do it, I think that would be really useful. And by language, I also don't necessarily mean just the language itself, but the words that are used. And Silk Road, for example, like you said, it's often a process of kind of explaining what that is. It might be interesting to see what kind of local versions of that might be, by tapping into some of the history, some of the different cultural understandings of connectivity. And so not necessarily using, or the campaign itself could still be the Silk Road campaign, but in terms of local discussions, it becomes something a little bit different, just to make sure that it resonates in the right sorts of ways.
Interesting. I mean,
but it'll depend very much on context, and again, that's where really good local partners can help out, because they'll be the ones that really get kind of how these sorts of concepts resonate with people in those places, which in a way that you or I probably wouldn't be able to understand, because we just are not from those places.
Yeah. No, fascinating. I mean, I think it's, even if we just take Europe, the European Union, the diversity of how local communities understand the term integrity or accountability is like, there is a huge spectrum, and to bring to activate this and to use this diversity for a dialogue. For example, around concerts we are planning along the European Silk Road in cities like Lyon or Brugge or Bratislava and Berlin and Vienna, to involve local communities in the co-creation process, in the question of how could be, or what could be the difference of a European Silk Road, or a European idea of connectivity or culture. What could be the difference? And then to translate these ideas and these voices and into this larger picture of creating such a European Silk Road. I mean, from your perspective, what could Europe do differently and better in this context?
You mean kind of generally? How could it better understand citizens?
In the context of dealing with diversity, with differences, with different understanding of an idea of accountability or even responsibility or listening. I mean, the listening traditions just within Europe. I mean, it's the French. The Debussy has a totally different listening world than Grieg or than Janacek or Verdi or Beethoven. And to use this diversity, what do you think? What could Europe do better or different?
It's a big question, obviously, and there's a lot of different pieces of it potentially. I mean, I do think one big piece is the one that you've caught onto here, which is the idea of making this positive rather than negative. So it's I mean, not that the European Union necessarily tries to emphasize differences, but making this an award, making it positive, understanding that celebrating responsible listening rather than pointing out just hearing or irresponsible listening is key, because that positive reinforcement is in all of the literature and in all of our experience what we've found to be what helps people connect, what helps people understand, what encourages them to do more of that particular action. So I think one thing is this positive narrative building around responsible listening. The second, I think, is as we've sort of discussed a bit, making it solutions oriented. I think one of the big problems with the EU, which Brexit is part of, is it's never been good enough, I don't think, at selling its success. I think it's got a lot better, but the EU is an incredible process and an amazing set of institutions, and I'm not sure that's communicated very well to citizens in many cases. It's too distant, it's too far away, it appears to be too bureaucratic, and so maybe using this process also to celebrate success. So creating positive narratives, selling success, which is more difficult now, than it has been, of course, because there are many challenges. But the successes, in many cases, I think are really at the local level, and engaging with them at that level, I think, is the place to start. If national politics are becoming too difficult, actually, it's at the local level where I think there are entry points and where the conversations can feed up to inform the bigger discussion. And I think it tends to be more feasible at the local level. People know each other better. In any case, power holders are closer to citizens. So actually, this kind of thing is, that's an easier place to start. Either at the city level or below that, in communities and in wards or whatever the equivalent is. And then I think it's, what you're doing, it's finding the entry point with citizens, which might not be through formal democratic processes or decision-making structures, but through things like music and film and art, and whatever it is in a specific context that people can appreciate and can understand and is universally understood, and so I think that's where it needs to be authentic. It can't be, in our case, for example, it's not that we say to people, you have to sing a song about corruption, because people see straight through that. It has to be an issue that they care about and in language that they understand. But often that touches on issues, and then you can draw out those issues in conversations around the music, and perhaps tie it to more formal processes. So, for example, in Nigeria, we had a big national rap contest, and the winners had their songs professionally made, and then we did a whole series of concerts before the election. But you could only get into the concert if you had been registered to vote. So it was great because we created this excitement, and all of the young people who were generally the ones that may not register to vote wanted to come to the concert. So then we worked with the elections commission to have booths outside where they could register to vote, and then and so we kind of drew them in through something that was authentic, but then linked it to a slightly more formal process, and got thousands of people to register to vote who otherwise wouldn't have voted, potentially. So yeah, finding kind of creative ways then to link it back up to maybe some of the more formal structures that the EU has and that people could benefit from.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, one last question, and one big challenge I see, if we're speaking about social media and like the role Twitter or Facebook or even Google plays in this context. What I observe is that on a practical level, it's really, as you say, like we must reach out to the local players, and there is really the grab to the contact point. Still, if we see Twitter, for example, or Facebook, the impression I got is that to share a question like how would you compose a Silk Road, as as an inviting, confirming question into a larger process, this is a totally different concept of how social media works. It's more like a very personal conversation, just like in a local context, translated into a digital space. But still, the digital space responds more to negative news or to hate speech, or to then this kind of interaction, that a positive message, a success story, or this kind of narratives seem not to reach. You cannot, you're not reaching the people we would love to have in the room. Does social media play a role for the Accountability Lab and for your work, and how would you describe it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to reach people, of course, a massive way to do that is through social media. Everything we do is all over social media. Again, because it's about meeting, for us, young people in particular, where they are, and that's where they are. There's no point in us setting up our own separate platforms for this, because building an audience is really difficult, and everybody is already somewhere else. So we need to tap into that. However, I agree that social media has become, in many cases, very negative. Has become often a difficult process in terms of engagement, and of course in terms of sort of democracy and institutions has become in some cases a negative influence. I think you're right that the way to use it constructively is by actually engaging and responsibly listening on social media, not just shouting about whatever it is that you care about, which is what many people do, including many leaders in political systems. And it's always interesting actually to look at on Twitter, for example, how many people are following others versus versus having followers. And actually, if you look at many people in positions of power, they are followed by a lot more people than they follow. And I think that says something actually about the extent to which they're listening to others. But so in terms of using it kind of practically, I don't know enough about the dynamics in the EU now vis-a-vis social media, but in many of the countries we work, WhatsApp actually is now really the platform that people are using to communicate. So it's not necessarily public, but you can tap into groups on WhatsApp. We've actually, for our institution, just created our own kind of WhatsApp channel, which allows us to be much more responsive and interactive with our communities. So it is much more of a conversation and much less of a process of posting news or kind of one directional engagement. For precisely this reason, I think social media has become in many ways a platform to push stuff out, but not really to listen. And I think there are ways that we have to try and think about moving beyond it. And WhatsApp for us is one, but there may be others, and there may be others that are more relevant in the context of the EU.